Hey, it's Andrew Shivas here, and I wanted to share something a little bit different with you today. Rather than a big idea, it's a big idea but broken down into some different stages based on something that I did when I was doing my degree in risk, crisis, and disaster management. And it was an idea that's intrigued me then. It's intrigued me since then. It's been nearly 10 years since then, and I've only really just gotten around to pulling it all together. I'm not quite sure what will come of this. There's maybe a really big idea here, like a unifying theory or some kind of thing. But right now, I think there are some takeaways that are worth sharing. They may all be relevant. Only one of them might be relevant. It may be that none of them are relevant. But I wanted to share them here either as things that would be of interest to you. They might be things that help you in your own work when you're thinking about risk, when you're thinking about when does a risk become a crisis. And maybe some ways to explain things to peers in your organization or managers. And this is titled Building on Turner, Toft and Reynolds. Turner, Toft and Reynolds were researchers. They collaborated on a number of papers, but the two big references you'll see here, Toft and Reynolds was learning from disasters, and then Barry Turner's book, Man-Made Disasters, all really looking at how disasters come around, what causes a disaster, and what can we learn from them, how can we actually look at a disaster and then go back and interrogate the facts to really get to the root cause. This was important in the degree because the degree was about risk, crisis, and disaster management. So a lot of it was being able to look at an event and then go back and really pick out what actually occurred and how it became a disaster, rather than maybe what the slightly more superficial apparent reasons were. So this plus a few other things in the course framework were interesting. They were things that we had to study, but then they provide this framework for thinking about risk and thinking about disaster and how they interact, which is what I'm going to look at here. And from this, I think there are sort of 7 takeaways, as I said, that might be of interest. One thing to clarify is what we mean by disaster here. This isn't the specific definition. There are multiple definitions, as usual, for all of these terms. I really like this one. It's a radical change in the normative environment. So often we think of a disaster as a huge amount of destruction, and often that is the case. But the key thing is that there's this radical change. So in many ways, digitization in the camera and photography space was a disaster for Kodak, because Kodak fundamentally changed after that. The company wasn't destroyed, but it was fundamentally changed. So arguably that was a disaster. If they had adapted to it and continued, it wouldn't have been a disaster. It could have still have been a major challenge, which it was, but because of the changes they had to make to the company, I would say that's a disaster. But I really like this. This definition here. So this is the model, the six-stage model. It's not the work of one individual or even the pair. It's really me taking all of the elements that they discussed and trying to break it down into 6 stages. So I don't know if this actually exists somewhere as a 6-step model, and if it does, and I haven't cited it, then apologies to whomever has done this. But you can break it down in this way. And remember, this is looking at how disasters occur, and I'll speak to that in a moment. But actually, it's easiest in some ways to look at stage 6, because a lot of their work was what can you learn from a disaster, and then it feeds back into these other stages to reduce the opportunities for those to occur in the future. But it begins in stage 1 with inception, because one of the key ideas is that the risks are baked in at the beginning. So whether that is a fault in the design of something mechanically, there's a fault in the way it is going to be constructed, the materials used, that is the fundamental problem underlying the system. Or it could be that in an organization, there is a process. Let's say you've got a really bad hiring process, really bad screening process, and it allows toxic managers, people that shouldn't be in your organization, to enter into your organization. The inception of whatever goes wrong is at that point when that process is badly written. Then you move on to operation, incubation. So that problem is still there. It's not incubating. It's really waiting for something to allow it to hatch. And that event is the catalyst, stage 3. the thing that then creates the conditions that could lead to a disaster. And we'll talk about the fact that it's not always going to lead to a disaster. But again, remember in this model, we're looking at how disasters occur. So here, stage 4 is the disaster, then recovery, and then this learning phase. And then you go back through again. So that's the model. We'll come back to that in a moment. But the first takeaway that jumps out is that the risk exists from the design inception stage. So from the very beginning, the risk is there. The thing that could go wrong is baked in quite early on. So two things you can take from that. The first is when you're designing everything, look at the what ifs. What if this were to happen? Have we mitigated that? So you can actually do a lot of the risk management in the design phase and think about designing the risk out. You won't get rid of all the risks. There's always going to be something, I think, in reality, but you can design a lot of it out if you're thinking about how could this go wrong? What are the unintended consequences of this? The second thing is that when you get to this learning stage or at any point when you're looking at something retrospectively, go further back, go to the inception, find the inception point. So find the cause of the event, not how it manifests itself. So to use that example of poor hiring practice, if you have a toxic manager who then is absolutely horrible in the workplace, a huge number of complaints, very high profile complaints, maybe even lawsuits and a lot of negative press coverage, that's a really trying situation for any organization. When that manager goes, that hasn't solved your problem. It solved the immediate manifestation of the problem, but the risk is still there because you've still got this crummy hiring process. You've still got these toxic people who've been allowed to enter into your organization. So one, you would have to get rid of them, but two, you really need to go back to the root, which is to fix that problem, have better screening, have better hiring practices, and then this won't occur again. So you can solve the incident, which is this particular toxic manager, but the risk is still there because you haven't gone all the way back to stage 1 and designed that out. So takeaway is go back to the as low a level as possible, as early as possible for the root cause, and keep that in mind when you're looking at the inception when you're designing. So another thing that we looked at in the course, and this isn't from Turner, Tofts and Reynolds, it was this idea of crises and emergencies, and you have an event, and the differentiation here was that if you know what the catalyst is, it's an emergency. And usually that's something that's relatively clean cut, and an emergency has a specific response plan. So whether that's something as basic as fire or an oil spill, it's an emergency. And I use the word basic in that it's relatively clear cut. Now that doesn't mean it's easy. And I always felt that the making a plan for an emergency is easy, but execution is hard. Fighting fires is hard. Mass casualty events are hard. The aftermath of a terrorist attack is hard. An oil spill, it's hard. These are hard to manage in the execution. But the planning is relatively straightforward because you can template out a lot up front. Whereas if you don't know what the catalyst is, then it's a crisis. So there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of opacity in what exactly is going on. So you might see the effects, but you can't really figure out what the cause is. So when you can see the effects, you're playing whack-a-mole and you're dealing with all those effects. But until you can get back to that root cause and deal with it, you're always going to have a challenge. And that's when it becomes a crisis, and essentially it can spin out because you just can't get your arms around it and really deal with the problem. So the second takeaway is that crises are a function of complexity and uncertainty, not magnitude. Because there is a feeling often, you'll hear people say, well, there's an emergency that can then become a crisis. We'll see in a moment, these can both lead to a disaster. You can have a big emergency. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a crisis in this context. The complexity hasn't necessarily changed. It's just bigger. Now, if you have something like Fukushima, where you have, I think, earthquake and tsunami and design issues around the nuclear plant, then that's much more complicated because you don't really know what's going on. It becomes more of a crisis because it's not one single thing. So that's not one big emergency. That's multiple things coming together. And each of these, it has an accelerating effect. So that is more of a crisis in that it's not exactly clear now where the problem is, what is causing the problem and how to deal with it. You've got multiple things to deal with. So it's not a bigger emergency. It's the complexity there that would make it a crisis. So this is where you bring all of this together, or where you can bring all this together. Now, I would say one of the reasons I've sat on this is I tried pulling all of this together in an essay that I submitted for my degree, and I was told to resubmit it. So that made me a little bit shy about trying to go down this road again. And I think because there is so much here conceptually, I mean, I wasn't able to explain it very well. I'm not sure if I'm explaining it very well now. It's taken me multiple attempts to make this video. But the point is, there's a lot in here, and I don't necessarily know if this hangs together, but it seems to hang together, and it seems to make sense for me. And the reason for bringing these together, if you remember when we looked at Turner, Toft, Reynolds originally, you go from stage 3, the catalyst, to disaster, because we're looking at how disasters form. If we add in this little logic tree to the right-hand side, we can then say, well, we have stage 3, which is the catalyst. Do we know what that is, yes or no? If we do, it's an emergency. We therefore probably have some kind of template to deal with it. If not, it's a crisis. We'll deal with it. We'll deal with it slightly differently. So what that means then is we can now see, how does the catalyst become a disaster? It doesn't automatically become a disaster. There are multiple pathways in which it could become a disaster. Remember that disaster is this radical change. It's not just the catalyst itself, it's how it's managed. And you can see here with successful management, it could be successfully managed, or it might not be. So that would take us on to the next takeaway, which is both emergencies and crises can lead to disaster. So in a large emergency, the mass casualty event, something particularly substantial, you may not be able to manage it successfully. It just might exceed the resources that you have. That could still lead to a disaster. You could have a crisis that you just never really quite get a handle on and understand what's going wrong. Could also lead to a disaster. So if we now think about what your operational stage looks like, we've said that the risks are designed in, they're there, they're incubating, and now you have this operational phase. And while that's going on, we have all these other events going on, whether those are events within the organization or external. And it's a little bit like a bicycle. A bicycle by itself is flawed, and it won't stand up, it'll fall over. So we can say let's for simplicity say that's the design fault there at inception. But once we start to operate the bicycle and cycle the bicycle, we have controls in place, and that allows us to have equilibrium, which is staying upright and moving forward. And those controls allow us to overcome these external events, these external forces. And by adjusting those controls, that allows us to maintain equilibrium. So it's the same with the organization. Everything that's going on in the organization and outside the organization, the controls are there to keep it balanced, to keep it, to allow it to adapt to those events, and then maintain this equilibrium and keep going in the same direction. So that's where we've got equilibrium now, because the controls are effective. So while the controls exceed the events and can manage the events, we've got equilibrium. That's the fourth takeaway. This is where the majority of organizations spend most of their time. They're in equilibrium. The company is operating, the business is operating, because their controls are allowing them to adapt and overcome to these external events, these external pressures and changes. However, if the controls are exceeded, then you move to the stage which is the catalyst. So you'll have some kind of event, either that is so big that it exceeds your controls, or that it was completely unexpected and you just didn't have anything in place to manage it. It then pushes you out of equilibrium. You're no longer able to control it, and that's when you move into stage 3, which is the catalyst. However, what I would say is it's not quite as clear-cut as that in reality. Things are blurry in the moment. It might not be immediately clear what that catalytic event is. It could be. Sometimes it can be very clear. There's an obvious flash or a bang or a headline in the Wall Street Journal. That's your big alert that something's happening. Remember, that might not actually be the event that's causing the problem. That's the red flag being raised that something has occurred. It's telling you that you've had that catalytic event, but it might not be telling you exactly what that catalytic event was. So it's more a sort of signal or alert, but it's not actually the event itself. Remember, it might not be immediately clear what the cause is, And in fact, it might not be clear until you get all the way through to stage 6, to the learning, that you can actually look back and be clear about, okay, what actually caused this? What was the catalytic event, and how did that occur that then led us into this situation? So things are very blurry in the moment. And that could be, it's not clear whether something occurred, 1 hour to the next, or it could be that something has been sort of incubating there for a long time, and you didn't see the signs until it had actually been there for maybe weeks or perhaps even months. So it can be a little bit blurry in the moment. On a more positive note, we've talked about managing the event, whether it's a crisis or an emergency. If you're not successful, it takes you to the stage for the disaster. But you can also be successful. So disaster is avoidable. And there are a lot of people spend a lot of time. I've spent a lot of time, and my friends have spent a lot of time trying to help companies prepare for these situations so they can manage them successfully, or helping them manage them so they can get through them successfully. So it's not a given that there will be a disaster. You can manage yourself successfully, come out of the event and move on to the recovery stage. That doesn't mean that you haven't sustained damage. It doesn't mean that there have been no losses. But what it does mean is that the degree of these losses, the degree of the damage, was not sufficient to cause this radical change. So you might be quite badly beaten up, but it hasn't changed your organization so much that it looks completely different, or has to take the business in a totally new direction, or worst of all, that the thing is destroyed completely. So disaster is not avoidable if things are managed properly. So that's the whole model. As I said, there's a lot there. I'm not sure if it all 100% hangs together. It makes sense when I look at it. It makes sense when I think about it. There may be flaws in this. There may be things that need a little bit more work. But as a way to think about how you go from a risk, and this is always a big challenge. We have risks. These are things that could happen. And then we have incidents, and those are the things that are happening. So how does the risk become an incident? And I think that's what we get from the theory, which is what could go wrong. That's built in at the inception. We don't know which one of these risks is actually going to occur. Some of them never do. During stage 2, that's when the conditions are created that allows this catalytic event to occur, when the controls are exceeded, and that's what takes you to stage 3. That's when you move into being the theoretical risk into the practical. That's an incident. Now it's happening. So that's the stage when things change. And then once you get into that stage, we can then think about, okay, do we know what it is? Are we going down the emergency route, where it's a case of really focusing on the execution of a plan and trying to execute as efficiently, as effectively as possible? Or is it a crisis, where it's more of a puzzle, trying to figure out, okay, what actually is that catalyst? How did we get here? And there's a lot more planning in a crisis before you move on to execution. So as I said, an emergency, easy to plan, hard to execute. In a crisis, sometimes very hard to plan, but sometimes it can be easy to execute, because you finally get that one thing that's causing the problem. Once you've solved that, everything else really sort of falls into place. So you almost have this opposite balance between planning and execution, between the two. And then you can move on to management and whether or not you manage it successfully or not. Really important to look at this stage 6 and learning and go back. This is after a disaster. It's equally important to learn from near misses. So the times you get away from it, the times that perhaps you do manage successfully. That's why even when you go to stage 5 recovery and haven't had a disaster, you still have to have this learning phase, because sometimes it's through good management, sometimes it's just sheer luck. So you have to really go through this learning phase to think about how can we design out some of those flaws all the way back at stage 1 and stage 2. So these are the 7 takeaways. I'm not going to go through them again. Some of these, I said, may be useful. They may all be useful. None of them might be useful. Some of them might give you some food for thought. Some of these things are areas that I want to look at in a little bit more detail in the future. But if nothing else, if maybe it's giving you something to think about, maybe it's giving you something or a tool to help you explain some of this to some of the people that you're working with, or a way to sort of think about how risks and risk incidents, risks, events, and crises and disasters sort of link together. The big thing for me is I'm really interested in looking at this, the signal and the noise. As I said, you've got this point when you go from the theoretical, what could go wrong, into the event, into when things are actually going wrong. Once they're going wrong, now you're dealing with the event. I think there's a lot that we can do to pick out the signal from the noise, to figure out, is that the event that's going to lead to the catalyst? Are we seeing wobbles in the system? The controls are still effective, but we're seeing more of a wobble. What is causing that wobble? Is it the events externally are getting bigger? The magnitude of the events are starting to exceed our controls? Or have things changed and the controls that worked 2 or 3 years ago no longer work anymore? What adjustments can we make? So it's really this area here. And it is blurry and it is unclear, and there's not always this nice, clean, now we're in equilibrium and suddenly we're not. It's a little bit like when water boils at this 99 to 101 degrees Celsius. The surface of the water is in this weird midway state. It's not quite a gas, it's not quite a liquid. And if you're a physicist, you can probably give a much better definition than I can, but the point is it's in this weird in-between. And so that's the practice of how these things occur. You've got this weird in-between moment, and you're not quite in a crisis or an emergency yet, but it's definitely no longer just theoretical. The sooner we can identify that we're getting into that transition point, and the sooner we can start to respond to it, the better. Effectively, we're still in the prevention rather than cure. And even if we're responding at the very early stages of an event, we're still going to have much more effect than if we wait. So the longer we wait, obviously, the greater the consequences, the greater the damage. It's much harder to get things under control. And when you start to look at things that are particularly complex, when you start to look at things that have a non-linear progression, like the spread of a disease, the earlier you can get in, you have disproportionately larger impact. The earlier you can start to deal with it than the longer you wait. So I'm really interested in this transition point and trying to pick out the signal from the noise and really nail down if we can identify these 1 or 2 flags or triggers, then that would allow us to respond early, even before things go wrong. So that's an area of particular interest to me for what it's worth. So as I said, it's a little bit of a big idea, but within that big idea, I think these 7 takeaways are interesting, and hopefully some of them are useful. I'm going to try and expand on these in some of the writing and thinking that I do over the next few months. And I hope that you found this useful. If you're looking for more like this, if you've been reading my stuff anyway, you'll know that I publish articles like this with varying frequency, usually every 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks or so. I'll be writing more on these in the future, but if you want to find more like that, you can take a look at the website and see some of the other things that I've been working on. And I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks so much for watching.